It is now time for lecture 6, in which we will be dealing with John chapter 5, getting a good background representing the temple and the pool of healing in the first century. It's kind of hard, so I just added this rather awe-inspiring chapel image, because the purpose of the temple was to actually produce some awe at the magnificence of the God who was worshipped there. So when we're in John chapter 5, we want to start out, of course, with an outline. John 5 breaks into 3 sections. The first 18 verses are about the healing itself and the consequences therein. Verses 19 through 30, we have a discourse, a lengthy statement by Jesus. And then that is followed in verses 31 through 47 by a continuation of Jesus' discourse, but it focuses on the witnesses to and the witness by Jesus. When we look at the first 18 verses, we want to break that down into standard concepts. So the first verses 1 through 3 is the setting. Then we have the miracle in chapter 4, or verse 4, verses through 9a. Then 9b through 12, we have conflict. That is then followed by recognition in verse 13 and 14. The self-identification in verse 15. And then that results in conflict in verses 16 and 17, and the result in verse 18. So when we look at the chapter, we see that there are different characters playing. We have at the beginning a great number of people there to worship at a festival, an unknown festival. We have then a multitude of individuals, a lot of sick, blind, lame people who are not allowed in the temple, but they're waiting outside the temple. We have a particular man who Jesus speaks with, and then he goes up into the temple. On the Temple Mount, not into the actual inner temple. As we noticed in chapter 2, there is a distinction. And there are those who are responsible for him following the commandments, and they address him. And there's a conversation between the man and the Jews, between Jesus and the man. And then the man goes back to the Jews, and the result is that those who are responsible for the Temple Mount are deciding. We have an introduction of a purpose, so that the rest of the book is shaped by that activity. After that, it's mostly the words of Jesus that are being spoken as he has the conversation with them all the way through the end of chapter 5. So what are the themes that we need to deal with? What are the issues? Well, the first is that this is an unnamed, or I should say undesignated festival. Unlike the others in this gospel, which are identified as Passover, as the Pentecost, as the Festival of Booths, and even the Feast of Dedication, or what we know as Hanukkah, this particular festival does not have a name given. I think, and many others posture, that this is a Pentecost situation, that it is a midsummer event, 50 days following Passover. Then they would take the first grains to the temple as their offering, though there's no symbolism of that actual event. However, it is also a time when they would read Torah. And so the association with what is written and what is the law causes myself and others to think that this is probably a midsummer, early summer, mid-June type activity. The second question is about the 5 porches or porticos. Now, for centuries, interpreters would talk about these porches as simply being an allegorical concept. They would associate with the 5 gods or the 5 husbands of John 4, and what they might have represented besides actual husbands. And so that these 5 porticos would represent some other kind of aspect, because there was no archaeological evidence of this particular pool. But that all changed in the early 60s and 1970s when archaeologists discovered this pool well beneath the walls of a monastery there, a church. And yet people still want to identify this in allegorical meaning. But the actual idea is that there were 2 pools. They have been unearthed and measured and documented, which had a wall around the outside. So you have a rectangle, so 4 walls, and then a wall between the 2 pools, making a 5th shadow. So you basically have 2 connected rectangles divided by a wall in the middle, or a roof, not a wall, but a roofed portico in the middle. When we look at that, we find that the new one, located beneath St. Anne's Monastery in Jerusalem, is about the size of a football field, and it's 20 feet deep. So it's fairly large. And many who approach this believe that it was what we call a mikvaot, M-I-K-V-A-O-T, a cleansing pool. And that's why the poor and the sick were located there, because the pilgrims coming to Jerusalem for this feast would need to wash in order to go to the temple. And so this mikvah was a place where they could walk in and wash, and there are stairs leveled around 2 of the sides so that they could get into the water and wash. It is also a running water. The situation is that the water is not a cistern-ish type. It is a running water pool. And so they were hoping that these religious pilgrims who were on their way to the temple to worship God would have compassion and care for the poor and the sick. And so Jesus is there walking through. He identifies a certain person. And so this is located on the north and northeast of the temple. Jesus is there, and the question that he asks the man is, do you wish to get well? Now, sometimes this is discussed as, do you wish to be whole? And to be whole is a necessary status. We have to understand the purification laws of the first century as they were practiced, declaring certain activities unclean so that one could not participate in the worship of Yahweh up on the temple at that point, or come in contact with those who were going that direction. But to be whole in this sense means to be absent from sickness. It's used 5 times in John 5, and then in chapter 7 it refers back to this episode. So John 5 is rather important in the timeline of the chronology of Jesus. What we have in chapter 5, once again, like we did find in John 2, after these things, John uses that. We don't have 7 days. It's like, so John 4 takes place. We have him going through Samaria. He heals the man's son by speaking a word when he is at Cana in Galilee. And now some time has passed. We don't know what's been going on during this time, but some time has passed. And so now Jesus has gone up to Jerusalem. When we look at a map, he's actually going down, but the phrasing in the New Testament is always they go up. So they ascend to Jerusalem, which is kind of an important word in John's gospel as well. So we have a change of scenery in verse 14, right? So we have, after these things, they go up to Jerusalem. And then in verse 14, we find that Jesus has now gone up into the temple. So we have one scene out by the pool, and the other is at the temple, or in a court of the temple, where he finds this person. And we have Jesus teaching in the temple which is a large space. And so to think that everyone be aware of Jesus' teaching as though it was a church that we would walk into, and all you had on the inside is a sanctuary. And so everyone knew that Jesus was teaching the sanctuary just doesn't make sense. It would be more like there's a parking lot surrounding a major football stadium, and Jesus is on one side of the parking lot talking, and the people on the other side have no clue that he's actually teaching. That would be a better physical, mental image than a small church or even a large church sanctuary where just speaking indoors, everyone could hear you. The question is not really the healing. The question is that Jesus heals on the Sabbath. And that is the problem, because the Torah taught that one could not do certain things on Sabbath. One was to honor the Sabbath, to keep the Sabbath holy. And so the idea is that he has violated the Sabbath instruction. In verse 16, it makes that clear. For this reason, the Jews were persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. And in verse 18, the other question is whether he is God. So there are two things at play. They're persecuting him because he's breaking Torah, but they want to kill him because he is committing blasphemy in their minds, that he is breaking the Sabbath. So here we have some key ideas. Now, in the answering, right, of them in verse 19, we have Jesus talking to them, and it is a confrontation language, because we don't have a question in verse 18, right? We don't actually see them asking Jesus a question. They've asked the man a question, but Jesus, responds, and indirectly to what is being rumored around him and not reflected in the text of John 5 as we have it. So there are other words that are important. In verse 15, the man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Now, here's the question. Is the man thankful for Jesus, or is the man turning his back on Jesus? The vast majority of interpreters over history have said he's turning his back on Jesus because he doesn't immediately follow Jesus. However, the fact that he tells the Jews is, and the language that is used, is that he is reporting to them new information. He is providing them testimony. He says, somebody healed me. That was the first report. Now he's telling them who it was, thinking, as a man who for 38 years has been outside the walls of the temple, that they would be excited to hear about this amazing thing that happened. So modern readers of John 5 who work in the literary sense, looking at what the story is unfolding, do not condemn the man for his report back to the Jews, because testimony and providing testimony is an important theme in this particular gospel. Now, there is a Johannine characteristic happening in the discussion with the man. We go back just briefly to the initial encounter. Jesus sees a man lying there, and he asks him the question, do you wish to get well? Now, the phrasing of that, do you wish to get well, is challenging, because if the man gets well, then he has to abandon 38 years of practice, 38 years of dependency upon others, 38 years of seeing himself as an outsider, one who is not allowed to go into the temple. It's really a very important question when one considers the situation more fully rather than just reading through the words of Jesus as though this was nothing big. It's a very big deal for the man. And his response is very telling because John uses a lot of irony. It uses quite a bit of misunderstanding. And so the man says, yes, I want to get well, but I have no one to help me. Because for him, being made well meant getting into the water. Occasionally there would be some healings that took place when someone would get into the water and be healed. It was a rare occasion, and one of the verses is not in most modern Bibles. You'll see that it can be put in brackets. It talks about the angel stirring up the water. And so some of the old manuscripts don't even have that, but it's kind of an explanation, right, for why they're laying there by the water. So his idea of healing is I have to get in the water. The reality is Jesus is standing right in front of him. There is a person to help him. And so one of the problems that we have in John chapter 5 is that Jesus sometimes asks the person a question. And the person takes it on one level. I must get into the water. But Jesus is actually talking on another level. We saw that in John 3 with Anothen, to be born from above or to be born another time, to be born again. And so Jesus simply speaks a word, as he did in John 4. He speaks a word, get up and walk. And so the man becomes whole. The man has someone to help him, but it doesn't involve the water. So that's part of the irony that John introduces. So we want to go ahead and pause there, and then we'll start looking at the discussion of Jesus' discourse and the words that he has and try to figure out some of what's taking place in that regard.